There is one thing more fragile than glass, more powerful than desire, and more dangerous than anger: a man's ego. You see, when you praise a man constantly, when you chase him endlessly, when you place him on a pedestal, he didn't build himself. You feed the illusion that he is in control. But the truth is, a man becomes truly obsessed not when you give him everything, but when you challenge his sense of self. The ego wants to be worshipped, but when you withhold that worship, when you pull back just enough, when you show him that your world doesn't revolve around his presence, something changes. The mind resists what it can't fully possess. That resistance, that curiosity, that need to win you over, that is what creates obsession. A woman who stands firmly in her power, who knows her worth, who doesn't over-explain or overgive, she stirs something in a man. Not lust, not admiration, but obsession, because for the first time his ego is not being fed, it is being starved, and in that starvation he begins to chase. Never mistake kindness for submission. Never mistake love for dependency. When you remain centered, when you are willing to walk away, he becomes magnetized to you. Hurt his ego, not with disrespect, but with indifference. The man who thought he had you figured out will now lose sleep wondering why he can't stop thinking about you. And that is the secret. You don't make him obsessed by giving more. You make him obsessed by giving less, but being more. A man's ego is not who he truly is. It is a shield, a construction built over years of conditioning, competition, and quiet fear. It tells him that strength means dominance, that love must be earned through control, that vulnerability is weakness. And when a woman comes into his life who does not feed this ego, who does not validate his superiority, who does not flatter his identity, the shield begins to crack. You must understand, obsession is not born from pleasure. It is born from tension, from an internal gap that refuses to be closed. When you give too easily, when you affirm too much, the ego is satisfied, and the pursuit dies. But when you withhold not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect, you disrupt his inner narrative. You shake the certainty he carries that he is desirable by default, and in that moment he begins to question not just you, but himself. Why isn't she impressed by me? Why doesn't she need me? Why is she not chasing me when others do? These are not questions of love, they are symptoms of a bruised ego, and it is from this internal conflict that obsession arises, because now it's no longer about you as a person. It's about what your detachment reflects back to him, the possibility that he is not enough. And this is where the chase becomes psychological. He wants to fix the mirror you hold up. He wants to reclaim the version of himself that felt strong and wanted in your presence. He wants to turn your silence into submission, your mystery into admiration, your boundaries into surrender. But the more he tries, the more that reflection stays unchanged. You didn't insult him, you didn't belittle him, you didn't attack his manhood, you simply remained calm, grounded, uninterested in playing his game. And without knowing it, you activated the oldest fear hidden inside the male ego, the fear of being invisible to a woman who is complete on her own. The human mind is addicted to patterns. We crave familiarity. We feel safe in repetition. When someone responds the same way every time, when they always say yes, always reassure, always show up immediately, the mind relaxes. It assumes, I know what this is. I understand this person. I control this dynamic. But what happens when you disrupt that rhythm? When the pattern breaks, suddenly, the mind no longer rests. The ego can't breathe. The subconscious starts asking, why did her energy shift? Why is she no longer reacting the same way? Did I lose something? Was it ever mine to begin with? This is the imbalance, and this imbalance becomes fuel for obsession. You see, obsession does not arise from balance, peace, or satisfaction. It rises from a void, an emotional question left unanswered. That question might not even be about love. It's often about control. And when a woman subtly withdraws, not dramatically but just enough to disrupt the pattern, she creates space in the man's mind. That space is filled not with clarity, but with craving. The ego seeks closure, but when you remain calm, non-reactive, and unpredictable, the ego becomes agitated. The man begins to spiral, not because of you, but because of the version of himself he can no longer stabilize in your presence. Why doesn't she react when I ignore her? Why didn't she text first this time? Why is she not emotionally available today? Every unanswered reaction becomes a riddle. Every unspoken boundary becomes a wall his mind wants to climb. He may try to reason it away, he may act colder, pretend it doesn't affect him, but inside the imbalance grows. The more he thinks about you, the more unstable he feels, and the more unstable he feels, the more he thinks about you. That is the loop. That is the storm within. Obsession is not passion. Obsession is not love. It is a psychological hunger to close a loop. The mind cannot explain a puzzle he never expected to solve, but now needs to. Most people confuse love with attachment. They believe that the more they give, the more they prove their worth. That constant availability, constant reassurance, constant presence will somehow secure their place in someone's life. But what they fail to see is this: value is not created through proximity. It is created through absence. Emotional detachment is not about coldness. It is not indifference born from pain. It is a calm, sacred power, the ability to feel deeply, but not be ruled by that feeling. It means being able to care for someone without losing yourself. It is a stillness that says, I can love you, but I do not need you to breathe. And to the male ego, this is both fascinating and disturbing. You see, a man often expects emotional dependency to come naturally. He believes attention is his right, especially if he is used to being chased. But when a woman doesn't chase, when she doesn't react, when she doesn't beg for his time or approval, she quietly sends a message. My world does not collapse in your silence. That message, that energy, creates confusion. Why doesn't she need me like others do? Why can she walk away so peacefully? Why does her silence feel louder than words? This is where value begins to form in his mind, not because you gave him more, but because you held back what so many others would have offered instantly: your emotions, your attention, your validation. Emotional detachment, when authentic, makes you rare. It shows that your peace is not for sale. That you choose presence, not out of fear of losing someone, but out of true alignment. And in a world where most are emotionally reactive, your calm restraint becomes magnetic. The ego wants to be fed. But when you don't feed it, when you remain unbothered, centered, and emotionally self-sufficient, the ego starts to starve, and in its starvation, it begins to chase, not because it loves you, but because it can no longer define itself without you. In the heart of many women lies a silent belief: if I give more, he will stay. If I prove my love, he will love me back. If I pour myself into him, he will never leave. But this belief, though tender, is dangerous. Because when you start giving from a place of fear, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of not being chosen, the fear of not being enough, your love no longer becomes a gift. It becomes a transaction. Overgiving is not kindness. It is a quiet form of self-neglect. The man who receives everything too quickly, your time, your energy, your devotion, doesn't see it as love. He sees it as default. The more you give without being asked, the more his ego becomes inflated. He no longer feels he has to earn your attention. He assumes it, and what is assumed is never valued. You must understand, men do not obsess over what they can easily consume. They obsess over what they must work to keep. The tragedy of overgiving is that it empties you while filling someone else's ego. You begin to lose your boundaries. You say yes when you feel no. You show up even when you're tired. You explain yourself when no explanation is needed. And all the while, you hope that your sacrifice will be noticed, appreciated, rewarded. But what often happens is the opposite. The more you offer without being asked, the less he feels the need to offer in return. He becomes used to the rhythm of receiving without effort. He stops trying. He stops wondering. He stops valuing. because when everything is given freely, the mystery disappears, the tension is gone. The desire to earn, to impress, to protect it fades, and instead of feeling loved, he feels entitled. But when a woman pulls back, when she stops overgiving and starts choosing herself, a shift begins. Not in her words, but in her energy. She no longer begs to be seen. She no longer overextends to be chosen. She becomes still, composed, grounded, and now the man begins to notice the absence he once took for granted. He realizes that the warmth, the support, the emotional richness she gave so freely is no longer there, and what he thought was always available now feels far away. It is in that distance, in that quiet gap where love used to be automatic, that obsession begins. The male mind is wired for pursuit, not just biologically, but emotionally and psychologically. He is drawn to the challenge, to the unknown, to the thrill of earning something that isn't immediately his. When something is just slightly out of reach, when it requires effort, attention, and focus, his ego awakens, and the hunt begins. But when he feels that he already has you emotionally, mentally, energetically, something in him relaxes. The urgency fades, the tension dies, and the ego, once activated by the need to win, begins to rest in the illusion of possession. You must understand, what a man possesses, he stops pursuing. But what he desires yet cannot fully claim, he continues to chase. And so, the moment a woman gives all of herself too soon, her vulnerability, her time, her energy, her emotional world, she removes the very thing that activates his passion, uncertainty. The mind doesn't obsess over what it understands. It obsesses over what it doesn't. When you remain slightly mysterious, slightly unavailable, not as a game, but as a natural expression of your independence, you create friction in his ego. He feels close to you, but not close enough. He thinks he knows you, but not completely. He believes he has you, but senses that he could still lose you. That tension is where obsession lives. It's the tension between certainty and doubt, between comfort and craving, between I know she's mine and I might have to earn her again tomorrow. The woman who is too available becomes invisible to the male ego, but the woman who is present without being possessive, loving without being dependent, warm but unafraid to walk away, she becomes unforgettable, because she never fully gives herself away. She keeps a part of her soul untouched, not out of fear, but out of self-respect, and that untouched space, that sacred part of her he cannot fully own, becomes the place where his obsession grows. He will replay your words, he will analyze your silence, he will seek meaning in your calm, he will feel drawn not to your approval, but to your distance, and that distance, that inch between what he has and what he still wants, is more powerful than anything you could say or do, because it keeps his mind active, it keeps his ego questioning, it keeps his desire burning. A man's ego is most comfortable when he feels admired without effort, when he is praised simply for showing up, when love is handed to him like a prize he never had to earn. But a woman with strong standards disrupts that comfort. She becomes a mirror not for his charm, but for his growth. She does not chase, she does not beg, she does not lower herself just to feel chosen. Instead, she becomes a mountain, still, grounded, and immovable, and that mountain forces him to climb. You see, the modern world is filled with validation, with likes, replies, quick flattery, instant gratification. A man can feel important without ever being tested. But when he meets a woman whose energy cannot be bought, whose time is not freely given, whose love is not unlocked by surface gestures, he finds himself facing something rare and unsettling. Her standards act as a filter. They say, I see your potential, but I do not accept your excuses. I appreciate your presence, but I do not tolerate your inconsistency. I am open to love, but only when it is offered with intention, clarity, and maturity. These boundaries do not repel a man, they reveal him, because a man who is only interested in comfort will walk away. His ego will feel offended. He will label her as too much or too difficult, not because she is, but because her standards expose the parts of him he hasn't yet developed. But the man who is ready to rise, the man whose ego is ready to evolve into character, he will feel something deeper, not lust, not entitlement, but a subtle, growing pull. Why can't I stop thinking about her? Why do I want to prove myself to her? Why does her strength feel like a challenge I want to meet? That pull is not about her beauty. It is about her energy. It is about the way she holds herself not above him, but beyond his reach until he chooses to grow. She does not reward laziness. She does not overlook red flags. She does not fall for charm without character. And the man who realizes this, who realizes that her presence is a privilege, not a right, begins to transform. Not because she forced him, but because her standards offered him a silent invitation, become more if you want to stand beside me. And that challenge to the right man is irresistible, because it speaks to the part of him that wants to be better not just for her, but for himself. The ego expects noise, it expects reaction, it feeds on drama, on attention, on a response, any response, even if it's rooted in pain. To the male ego, the worst thing is not rejection, the worst thing is being ignored, because rejection still acknowledges presence. But indifference says, you are irrelevant to my peace. And nothing bruises a man's ego more deeply than a woman who no longer reacts. You see, most people confuse silence with weakness. But true indifference is not silence born from suppression, it is silence born from strength. It is the kind of quiet that comes from knowing your worth so deeply that you no longer need to explain it. No need to chase, no need to beg, no need to prove anything. When a man speaks with arrogance and a woman responds with neutrality, he is shaken. When he disappears for days and she doesn't reach out, he is confused. When he tries to provoke a reaction and she remains still, he is disarmed. This is not a tactic, this is not manipulation. It is the raw expression of self-respect, a sacred kind of detachment that comes from knowing, I will not exhaust myself trying to make someone see me, I see myself. And this to the ego is threatening because the ego wants to matter. It wants to dominate your emotions, to live rent-free in your mind. But when a woman's energy is clean, when her nervous system is calm, when she doesn't flinch at inconsistency or ghosting or games, she becomes unreadable. And that unreadability becomes power. The man who once believed he could control her feelings now finds himself controlled by his own. He begins to overthink. He replays the last conversation. He wonders why his charm didn't work, why his withdrawal didn't trigger her, why his silence was met with even deeper silence, because she is no longer playing the same emotional game. Her indifference isn't loud, but it's deafening. It forces him to sit with himself, to question why he needs her attention to feel powerful, to realize that maybe, just maybe, her lack of response is not a punishment, it's a boundary, and that boundary becomes unforgettable. Because it's the first time he meets a woman who doesn't react to provoke him, doesn't engage to fix him, doesn't speak to soothe his ego. She simply lets him feel the weight of her absence, and that absence speaks louder than any message she could have sent. In a world that constantly teaches women to prove their worth, to be more available, more understanding, more accommodating, it is a radical act to remember, you are the prize, not because of ego, not because of arrogance, but because of the sacred truth that your time, energy, and love are not to be handed out like free samples. They are earned not through manipulation or pressure, but through consistency, respect, and emotional maturity. A woman who forgets she is the prize will begin to chase. She will adjust her standards to meet someone else's comfort. She will silence her needs to keep the peace. she will over-explain herself to avoid abandonment. And in doing so, she will dim the very light that once made her magnetic. But when a woman returns to herself, when she reclaims her throne, and remembers that love is not something to win, but something to receive, her entire energy shifts. She no longer needs to compete. She no longer needs to perform. She no longer begs to be seen. Instead, she becomes still, rooted, certain of who she is, and this stillness is not passive. It is powerful. Because now, she does not chase attention. Attention moves toward her. She does not seek validation. Her very presence commands it. She is not trying to be enough. She simply is, and the man who encounters this kind of woman feels it immediately. Not in her words, but in her boundaries, not in her beauty, but in her self-respect, not in her willingness to please, but in her willingness to walk away. He senses she's not afraid to lose him because she was never trying to possess him. She's not trying to be chosen. She already chose herself, and this energy, rare, pure, grounded, becomes unforgettable. Because in a world full of people begging for love, chasing attention, proving their worth, she becomes the exception. The woman who knows she is the prize never forces connection. She observes, she receives, she responds with grace, but never desperation. And the man who realizes this, the man who thought she would chase like the others, begins to feel something unexpected, the need to rise. Not because she demanded it, but because her very presence requires it. We often believe that presence is built through constant communication, frequent texts, endless conversations, visible affection. But sometimes the most powerful presence you can offer is your absence. You see, when you are always there, always available, always replying, always offering emotional access, the mind of the other person begins to normalize your presence. They stop feeling you, even though you're right in front of them. The ego becomes entitled to your energy, and what was once special becomes expected. But when you step back, not out of spite, not to manipulate, but from a place of dignity and inner peace, something shifts. Your absence becomes louder than your words. It creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, your value becomes amplified. The man who once took your time for granted now notices the quiet. The man who once felt in control now senses something missing. The man who assumed you'd always be there begins to question why he feels uneasy in your distance. Because presence is not about how close you are physically, it's about how much your energy matters in someone's emotional world. And absence, when grounded in self-respect, makes your presence unforgettable. It gives a man the space to feel, to reflect, to miss you in a way that he cannot when you are constantly filling the space. The ego may tell him, she'll come back, but the heart starts to whisper, what if she doesn't? And that whisper grows louder with every hour of silence. With every moment he reaches for his phone and sees nothing from you. With every flashback of your presence, your voice, your calmness now unavailable, absence forces emotional clarity. It breaks the illusion that you need him more than he needs you. And the longer you remain still unattached, unbothered, the more his ego begins to collapse under the weight of what it once had but didn't fully appreciate. Because now, he has space to feel you again. Not through your words, not through your actions, but through your withdrawal. And that feeling becomes an echo in his mind. He replays old moments. He imagines what you're doing. He begins to wonder what went wrong, what changed. He doesn't realize that your absence isn't punishment, it's a reflection of your truth. That your presence is a privilege, not a promise. And the man who begins to feel the depth of that absence, without explanation or closure, will start to understand just how deeply you were woven into his inner world, not because you tried to belong there, but because he took for granted the energy that no longer surrounds him. There is a quiet art to influence, and it does not live in manipulation, blame, or cruelty. It lives in awareness, and if you wish to awaken something deep within a man, you do not need to attack him. You do not need to insult him. You do not need to play games. All you must do is stop feeding his ego. You see, most men live through their ego, the invisible mask they wear to feel powerful, important, validated. The ego craves approval, it feeds on praise, it expects attention, and when it receives all of this without effort, it becomes lazy, it assumes that love is owed, that presence is permanent, that he doesn't need to earn what is already freely given. But when a woman stops feeding that ego, when she withdraws her attention, when she no longer responds to mediocrity, when her energy is no longer reactive, something in the man begins to shift. He doesn't feel attacked. He feels unseen, and to the ego this is unbearable, because the ego believes it is the center of everything. It wants to dominate her emotions, command her responses, control her availability. But when she becomes still, not out of anger, but out of quiet knowing, she disrupts that illusion. She hurts the ego not with cruelty, but with neutrality. She doesn't try to correct him. She doesn't argue her worth. She doesn't prove her loyalty. She simply disengages. She holds her center. She no longer reacts. And now the man is left with silence, not just her silence, but the silence of his own ego, now starved of the attention it once relied on. He begins to wonder. He rethinks the moments he took lightly. He replays the conversations where she gave her heart, and he gave his ego. He starts to feel the absence not just of her presence, but of her energy, her softness, her acceptance. And that absence becomes painful not because she hurt him, but because she stopped feeding the false version of him that needed to be worshipped, the version that never had to rise, the version that thought love meant control, the version that never had to earn her. And now, without that emotional nourishment, the ego begins to collapse, not publicly, quietly, internally, in moments when he lies awake and wonders why she no longer reaches out, why she no longer explains herself, why her love now feels like a memory instead of a mirror, because she didn't destroy him, she didn't shame him, she simply stopped recognizing the part of him that was never real, the ego that demanded everything, yet appreciated nothing. And in that absence, she gave him the opportunity to meet himself not as the man he pretended to be, but as the man he must now become. So, understand this. You do not need to manipulate a man to capture his attention. You do not need to lower your standards to be loved. You do not need to chase, to overgive, to explain, or to lose yourself in the process of being seen. The woman who holds herself with grace, who walks in silence when disrespected, who knows her worth so deeply that she does not need to announce it, that woman becomes unforgettable, because obsession is not born from chaos or control. It is born from energy that cannot be owned. When you no longer feed his ego, you awaken his soul. When you no longer chase his attention, you become his curiosity. When you become the woman who is whole on her own. He realizes he was never the one choosing, he was the one being chosen. And by then, it's no longer about making him obsessed. It's about whether you still want him, now that you've remembered the power of being wanted without needing to be one.